So imagine you're hosting a dinner party and you're setting the table. You're gonna have fish and potatoes. So I was doing this a couple years ago, and I set the table and I put forks to the left, and I said, you don't need knives. That's all soft food. Nothing needs to be cut. Why would you put out knives? Well, the first person to show up was a Belgian bloke, and he says to me, so American of you to not put knives at the table. I was appalled. I had no idea what was happening. Like, was there this cultural thing I didn't know about that supposedly you're supposed to put knives and that's just an American thing not to? Well, this got me on my journey of discovering, like, what's the cultural implications of cutlery and where did they all come from in the first place? So we'll start with a map, and this is kind of a distribution of different eating utensils and different eating styles around the world. So a lot of places actually still use their hands or bread. And then there's also a lot of fork and knife, but China and other Asian countries have the chopsticks. You'll notice, though, that Thailand does not use chopsticks. They instead use a fork and a spoon because they had more ties to Western nations like the US than they did to those Asian nations that were next to them. But now we'll jump back to 2.6 million years ago, when they found the first utensil used by humans, and they found it in Ethiopia, and it was a knife sort of thing made out of stone that was used to cut at animals because we no longer had the teeth that were able to make it so we could, like, gnaw at them with our faces, you know, that sort of thing. And this predates fire by 1 to 2 million years, so it's pretty early on invention. And then we get to the development of the knife. So as different metals and things like that were improving, and as people were developing, they started changing the way they use the knife. The dough knife in China is kind of an all-purpose knife, and this was able to be made after the invention of cast iron because that was much cheaper than bronze to use this big chunk of metal in a knife. Similarly, in Europe, they were developing knives, but making them more personalized. So in China, it was like using this big, huge knife in the kitchen. In the medieval era, it was in Europe, the people using personalized knives. So everyone had them tied around their waist. You can kind of see here. Yeah, you just had a personal knife that you carried with you everywhere. Like at a dinner table, there wouldn't be a setting out of cutlery. You would just bring your knife with you. And you would actually hold it in a stabbing position, and you would stab at your food. Sometimes you would put your food in your mouth and then, like, saw it off. That's called the stuff and cut. At the height of knife usage, they were using 2 knives, so one to stabilize and one to cut, and that was the highest class. So men, women, children, they all had knife. This little girl here, she's got her personal knife. Everybody's got it. It's great. Also protection. I don't know if I mentioned that. So knives were really popular. Everybody had them. But in the 1637, there was a clergyman who saw that someone at his dinner table was taking a double-edged knife and picking his teeth. And he's like, that's not cool. I don't like that. That's really unrefined. Let's not do that. And so he made knives be blunt at his house. And he was also an advisor to King Louis XIII in France, and kind of influenced him to enforce this idea of taking knives off the table. So after this point is kind of when France started removing knives from the table, and the British, they followed along in a similar fashion and came up with the idea of the butter knife, which is just pretty useless except for cutting butter. So, like, the point of the knife is now taken away because, oh, someone picked their tooth with a knife, you know. But the French figured out a couple hundred years later, that that wasn't a good idea, and that you kind of need knives to cut things when you're at the table. And so they reinvented the idea of putting knives at the table with the steak knife. So that's the story of knives. The next utensil that was invented was the spoon. And the spoon was invented maybe around 30,000 years ago, not million. Too many numbers. And the spoon, the first one they've decided was taking a shell and tying a piece of wood to it to make it like a handle. And you could scoop things with that. That was very practical. And in Greece and Latin, the word for spoon derives from a snail's shell, so probably still linked to that concept. On the other hand, in England, in Old English, the word for spoon derives from a chip or splinter of wood because they more likely made spoons by whittling away at wood. So that's pretty cool. The next utensil invented was not the fork, it was the chopsticks. And chopsticks were originally created to take hot things out of food. So like big boiling water or hot oil, you don't want to reach your fingers in there and grab something. So yeah, let's invent these long sticks that can do it for us. Great idea. It took a while for those to end up at the table, though. They were mostly used for cooking until 1200 BCE, when they were found as serving utensils. And all of this is happening in China, the invention of chopsticks and the serving utensils. And Confucius played a big role in the uptake of chopsticks as well. Tied in with the idea and the invention of the tall knife that I mentioned, everything could happen in the kitchen. They could prepare everything, cut it into small portions, and then serve it at the table in small serving sizes that you could pick up easily with your chopsticks, which were really good because they were non-violent. Like, you would remove the knives from the table, you'd remove these pokey things, whatever they may be, and just have it easy and to be able to be done with chopsticks. So eventually, in the Han Dynasty is when the widespread use of chopsticks in China happens. And eventually they spread to other places like Japan and Korea. So Korea mostly uses metal chopsticks, and then Japanese use shorter and spikier chopsticks. So again, Confucius, nonviolence, Chinese chopsticks, really blunt. Japanese, not so much, because they didn't care, I guess. Hopefully nobody got stabbed with the chopsticks, though. I don't know. And this is my favorite. So in 1700s, there was the invention of the waribashi, which are disposable chopsticks. You've all probably used them before if you go to a takeout restaurant. But the reason wasn't for takeout. It was because in Shinto Japanese culture, the idea is that if someone puts chopsticks in their mouth, it takes part of their soul. So to be at a restaurant and to use someone's chopsticks, or use chopsticks that are there, you don't know whose soul they've ingested, and you don't want to put that in your mouth. You'd ingest some evil person's soul. It would be bad. So disposable chopsticks solved this problem, made it so everybody felt more comfortable about using their own set of chopsticks, keeping their souls clean, you know. Finally, we get to the invention of the fork. So relatively recently compared to the rest of the other utensils, and it was mostly used in the Middle East, and it was always this kind of two-pronged fork at that time. It wasn't introduced until in Europe until 1004, when a Byzantine princess married the Doge of Venice in Italy and brought with her her two-pronged gold fork. But the clergyman saw that and damned her and said, this is devil's business, like, it looks like a pitchfork, she's going to hell, and when she died of the plague, they rejoiced. So not accepted at all. But the Italians had some brains on them because they said, why are we eating pasta with a little stick? Like, a wooden stick was what you would twirl your pasta around. It sounds super hard. So instead they're like, oh yeah, the 2 or 3 prongs, that'll really help us pick up these giant things of pasta. They even at one point in time invented a fork that has a little spinny thing on top and the tines twirl around so you can like twirl your pasta on. So great, so smart. And the rest of Europe didn't accept the idea. The Italians were the only one using forks for quite a long time until Catherine de' Medici, which was an Italian woman. She married the King of France and brought with her forks from Italy. And because she was a super popular figurehead of the time, everyone took fashion advice, looked up to her, kind of like Kim Kardashian today. They all said, well, she's doing it, we can use forks too. And that's when the French started actually using forks. The Brits held out for a little while longer, though. In the 1600s, there was a British bloke who went to Italy and brought back forks, and people called him a furcifer, which is a fork bearer, and did not accept the fact that he was using forks. It was still devil's business back then. But then in 1633 or so, King Charles I of England declared that it was acceptable to use a fork. So finally, the Brits could free their knives and pick up the fork instead. And from there, it kind of spread into the rest of Europe. And being Germans, they had to optimize it. So the Germans took the fork and they said, do we use three tines, or do we use 5 or 4? And they decided 3 was not enough for stability. 5 was too much in your mouth, like just too many things. And so 4 was the ideal number, and it would make everyone happier. And forks were popular enough that in 1769, when James Cook came to New Zealand, he brought the fork with him and introduced it to the Maori people, who previous to that had been using their hands. Speaking of hand usage, there was still a lot of hand usage up until this point. So in Naples, Italy, even though pasta was what brought the fork into Europe, it was also what the poor people didn't use, because they would just pay a little bit amount of money on the street and get this fistful of pasta and shove it in their mouth in one go and just swallow it whole. And tourists were actually paying money to watch this happen. So it was a big tourist draw at the time, but fork usage still wasn't a thing for them. It wasn't until the early 1800s that the fork actually took off in popularity enough so that it wasn't being outsold by spoons and knives anymore. And this is actually the point also when it was introduced in the US. Prior to that, they had been using spoons and knives. Forks became so popular, some fashionable Brits decided that they should eat soup with forks. It only lasted a short time before somebody, I don't know who, said it didn't make sense to use a fork for soup, so they stopped doing that. It was too foolish. But there was some holdouts, especially a group of British soldiers. They said, real men don't use forks, we use our hands. That makes us masculine and good. So hands, best utensil so far. So I'm blabbering on about forks and utensils and whatnot, and why should any of you even care? Like, maybe it's kind of interesting, but it's actually changed the shape of our jaw. So before, when you're eating with like the stuff and cut, remember putting in your mouth, sawing it off, or just like chewing on big pieces of meat, you have to use your incisors a lot. And so they get worn down, and it makes it so your jaw can be in an alignment and fits. And so when you look at monkey skulls or old human skulls, your jaws are in alignment. But not having to do that, having soft food that is cut with a butter knife, therefore not cut, or using chopsticks and not having anything cut on the table, all of that made it so our incisors could erupt more, and our jaws are now offset, and that's considered proper. And this archaeologist and professor named Charles Brace, he went around the world and headhunted skulls to see at what time the shape of the jaw changed. And he found that in Europe it happened 200 to 250 years ago. In the US it was a little more recent because it took them a while to adapt the fork. And then you might ask about China, where they'd been using chopsticks. Well, there it was 1,000 to 1,200 years ago that they saw this change in alignment. So it seems to point that this is actually something that has affected us, just how we eat. Now our whole bodies are different. So as Caleb mentioned, I do have some background in etiquette, so I'll give you a quick etiquette lesson. So the European way to cut your food is called the European way, I don't know. And you cut, and then you keep the tines of the fork down, and you put it in your mouth. And you always have both utensils in your hand, the tines never flip up. In the US technique called zigzag, you cut, put the knife down, switch hands, scoop, and then put it in your mouth. It seems super inefficient, but actually it's probably because, as I mentioned before, that using a spoon and knife is what was done in the US up until the 1800s. So having to have that spoon and scoop something is why they would have to switch and then flip over the fork. Nowadays, a lot of Americans use the European technique, but the interesting thing about the European technique and the difference with American is that in the US, we don't care about the knife. Like, if the knife's not there, it doesn't matter. But in Europe, you always have to have both in your hands when you're at the table. And that's because during King Louis XIV's time being king in France, he thought someone was going to poison him, and he was scared of what was going to happen. So he said, okay, everyone at the dinner table, you have to keep both your hands on the table where I can see them at all times. And at this point, people were just using one knife, so it was like awkwardly just resting one hand and then using one knife. But then when the fork got invented, it just made sense to hold both. So then your hands are doing something on top of the table, not just like resting on the side. So that's probably why there's the difference there. And throughout all this time, there's this uptake of utensils, uptake of new technology, you could say, and all of it actually made your food taste bad. Because before stainless silver became widespread enough and mass producible, it was using bronze, iron, gold, silver, all of which reacts with the food that we eat, especially acidic food. And so you'd get this taste of metal in your mouth, you'd get really negative influences from the cutlery you're using until after stainless steel. And now in this portion of the talk, I'll just run you through some interesting utensils that I found that I thought you'd enjoy. So the first was a patent for a mustache spoon in 1890. Super practical, right? Like, just keep that soup or whatever away from your mustache. It's a great idea. I don't know why we still don't have these. And you'll actually probably be surprised that the spork is not a recent invention. It made its way into the dictionary in 1909, so quite an old technology. Don't know what it looked like back then, but it wasn't patented until 1970. Sorry, I'll go back to this one and say, most of you have probably used this spork, and they're just not good at either, right? And usually if you get them from a takeaway place, they're so flimsy, like they don't even do anything. There was a stabbing in 2004 with someone with a spork, but like that's the most that you're gonna get out of spork, really. And yet we're insistent on using them rather than using our hands, which is just an easier utensil to use, but that's just my side thing. In 1943, the invention of the splade, which was an Aussie bloke who combined the spoon, fork, and knife together. And he did this because he saw an advert of a woman with plates and spoons and forks and everything spread across her lap, and he thought this would just be simpler and more efficient to use. Debatable, but... So there's actually a lot of different combinations. All of these combinations fall under the general category of sporf. And you're probably familiar with a spife. I don't know, I've used that as a kiwi spoon, knife on one end, spoon on the other. It's great. There's Nork. There's the chork. That's cool. Very nice. And now we're moving back into using our hands a little bit with the invention of these add-ons that you can put on your fingers. Pretty good. And the last interesting thing I found was the Fred, which is given to all Australian Defence Force people. And it just seems like it would stab you, but also not be big enough to actually eat out of. So I don't know if that's any help at all, but that's utensils for you. So now that I've given you a rundown of the invention of utensils and kind of a summary of them, I hope that you think about how you're eating your food and what you're eating it with, because sometimes our default of grabbing that fork and grabbing that knife is not always the best idea. So just maybe play around with the ways that you eat your food. Thanks. Any questions? Yeah.
What's your favorite utensil and why?
I know I should have thought about answers to these questions before. Yeah, I don't know. I think chopsticks are good because they are like an extension of your hand. So you get to keep your hands clean, but still kind of get that tactile sensation from eating the food. We'll go with that. Yep.
You touched on the cutlery affecting the draw,
Mm-hmm.
and then you also mentioned the American and European method with the tines flipped. Have you found any evidence to suggest that the way the tines affects the draw slightly?
It's a good question. I haven't found anything about that. I also want to say that in the US, the zigzag technique is not really used anymore. I was introduced to it in etiquette, and they're like, this is the way you're supposed to do it. But for the most part, people use the European technique. So I don't know when that switched and if it would have had an influence for a short time, but it's a good question.
From an etiquette perspective, what do you think of the kind of US style idea of using chopsticks to eat really like greasy chips out of a packet?
Is that a US thing? I've never seen it.
Chopsticks on Doritos or
Oh, yeah? Okay. I've not seen that. I mean, it makes sense. Like I said, chopsticks are like an extension of your hand, so keep it clean. I personally eat popcorn out of a cup, because then you just pour it in your mouth. It's a really efficient way to do it. Good to keep your hands clean. Yeah.
Any examples of sort of surreptitious fork use where people figured out it was really good, but it was still kind of like your wrist being like stoned to death, and you were like, what was it? It's like that sort of undercover guy.
I don't think so. I think there was a lot of people saying you're like the devil for using a fork, or like you'll be damned for using the fork, and they might have celebrated if someone died, but I don't think there was an active retaliation against the person. No. Sorry.
In your investigations, have you seen anything that linked the uptake of the various implements with any like big changes in how people ate in those different areas? Like you've got a fork, suddenly you can open up a whole new bunch of food you can eat.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the fork. I would say the chopsticks and like the Chinese way of eating was probably the most influenced, because the tall knife and then Confucius's teachings of not having any knives on the table made them cut up food more in the kitchen. It was also a fuel efficiency thing. So the Chinese didn't want to use a lot of coal when they were cooking, so the smaller you cut it, the faster it cooks. It was better for that. So I think those tie in more closely. I did read a book where I got a lot of these facts from, which is called Consider the Fork. So recommend it if anyone wants some fun kitchen facts. And that talked about the evolution of how serving was done. So there was a lot of topics on when the food is brought to the table, what happens. And there used to be people who were employed to serve your food and plate it in a certain way. So the utensil usage and the utensils used to serve food were very influenced by that practice as well.
Last one in the back.
What about the development of all those, like in fancy dinner, all those different forks, different knives, and different spoons? When did that come in?
From memory, I read the book a year ago. Let's see, I think it was the French, because the French like making everything kind of rule following in terms of foods. And so they came up with a system. After the Italians like said, oh, this is cool, we should use it, the French are like, well, we'll make it better. And we'll give you all these rules of like these different forks for these different things. And so they brought in, different pots for different purposes, different serving utensils, different forks, and all of that. Yeah. Thank you.